So we're in chapter 28, section 3 now of your U.S. history book. We're going to be talking about the daily life during the 50s, 60s, and 70s period. This was the period of the Cold War, President Eisenhower all the way to President Carter. So we're going to go over what it means to be baby boomers, immigration during this time, family life, modern conveniences, culture, literature, art, radio, and television, and film, and sports during this time. You can see here's baby boomers. Here's a picture of all these babies being born during the time here. I love the Beatles, and of course we have the culture then of the kind of the hippie movement culture going on. So let's begin. Baby boomers. Well, World War II came to an end and over 10 million service members returned home to return to their normal lives. And most got married and began to have children. And these new families began to grow. So between 1946 to 1964, over 70 million babies were born. Because of the growth in family, this time is known as baby boom generation or baby boomers. Many were instilled with the values and morals of their service member parents had fought to defend, and they learned the value of hard work and the rewards of one's labor. But as the Cold War advanced, some wanted freedom from the norms of their parents. So here's some pictures, baby boomer time. You can see the babies being the time of the baby boomer generation. It says here, you can see the time here. Here's, Elvis Presley here. You can see here Kennedy, that time of Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and here, these are the Supremes singing, astronauts, cars, Beatles, all these in the baby boomer generation. And here's a picture of some of the baby boomers there. So basically it was during the time that the Army members, the service members came back, and everyone wanted to go back into their family life, and many children were born during this time. And which I'm right at the end of the baby boomers at this time. My parents could have been at that time in World War II, maybe, but Papu, his dad was in World War II. So baby boomers. Immigration Reform McCarran-Walter Act. So in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, which outlined the American immigration policies, continued to require ethnicity quotas and remove immigration policies. But in the mid-1960s, the government began allowing immigration based on specific preferences, such as reuniting a family instead of using the quota system. The United States also received refugees that were fleeing communism and began allowing Central Americans to come to America as workers. So during the Cold War, over 18 million immigrants came to the U.S. You can see some of these immigrants. So when you look at the McCarran-Walter Act, you look back, it passed a law that reestablished the 1924 Act quotas, and actually President Truman at that time vetoed this because he said it was the most un-American law, because it went back to the old quotas he thought were very much discriminatory. So at this time, the McCarran-Walter Act comes back in, but then again, in the mid-1960s, these immigration based on specific preferences now were more important, such as having to reunite a family or being a refugee. Those things were more important than the quotas made. The quotas had to go on, basically your ethnic groups. And so they kind of did away from 1952 to 1960 with the ethnic rules that were put forth in the McCarran-Walter Act. So just to know that the McCarran-Walter Act looked like it was good, but really it wasn't at that time. And later on, it became not even possible to go by that McCarran-Walter Act. Anyway, so just to let you know about it. Increased population. So in 1940, the population of the United States was just over 132 million people. The baby boom and immigration caused the population to increase to 248 million by the end of the Cold War. Another factor is that people were living longer. The life expectancy increased from 47 years in 1900 to 68 years in 1950 and to 75 years by the end of the Cold War. So you can see how the population would increase. So just know by 1940, the population in the United States was 132 million. And then by the end of the Cold War, it was 248. So we're talking about in the 1960s, it was 248 million by end of the Cold War. So that's a huge jump from 132 to 248. But one of the reasons is people were living longer. So you see, you just think, in 1900, they only lived till 47 years old, usually people, in the 1950 to 68. But now most people can live to 75 years old or longer. So here we go, life expectancy, how it's going up with life expectancy. And here is basically the population increasing. You see the white population, ethnicities of Black and Asian and Hispanic, and how these populations are going up during this time. Average everyday life. The need for affordable and convenient places for families to live became apparent. Levittown, New York City, or on the outskirts of the company, Levitt & Sons began building prefabricated homes for returning soldiers and their families. As the soldiers were coming home, they would need homes, and they were getting married and having families. And so in New York City, one of the builders decided, okay, we're going to start building these homes. They look exactly alike, really, maybe different colors or so, or a little bit different. And this is a picture of Levittown. They called it Levittown because it was Levitt and Sons, or Levitt and Sons. So Levittown. Many of the men, it says, Levitt and Sons continue building affordable neighborhoods in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Maryland, and even in Puerto Rico. So they not only in New York City, they went on to other areas. And many of the men commuted to the city to work because these prefabricated homes usually were on the outskirts or in the suburb areas, not right in the middle of the city. Numerous Americans began moving to the suburbs. So in 1960, the Americans in the suburb were equal to the percentage living in the city, which is a big jump. So as many people living in the suburbs, there was many people living in the city. So most people, of course, had to commute. Family life in the 50s. So we're going to start with the 1950s. What was family life like then? Most families did not achieve economic freedom until several years after the war had ended. So they were paying bills, and they probably were in debt. We're not economically free yet. Many families were just getting started, and few had extra spending money at all. Married women often in the 1950s stayed at home while their husbands worked, and children went to school and spent extra money in the soda pop shop. So children didn't have a lot of money to spend. The majority of children never went to college, but started a career after high school graduation. In the evenings, the entire family ate together and discussed the happenings of the day. And following dinner, the children played or did homework, while the parents talked or read. Sometimes the entire family would gather around the radio, or if they had a television, when the primitive television, they'd watch a television program in the 1950s. So here's a picture here. Here's the old television here. They're gathered around, or the radio. Here they're playing games. He has a train here. And here they usually ate together. Most of the children at this time, when they grew up, they graduated from high school and then they started a career. Rarely did they go to college during this time. So this was during life in the 1950s. I was born in 1958, so at the end of the 1950s. So my life was mainly in the 1960s and 1970s. So family life in the 1960s now. The typical family became wealthier and more families moved to the suburbs. Many women took job outside the homes, so there are many of the mothers working outside the home, not at home all day. And so the families now shared household chores together because the mother wasn't always doing the chores. So now they all had to do their chores, right? Parents now could buy toys for their children. And so they were interested in buying more things for their kids. And the toys were a main attraction during this time. The toy industry tripled, with popular toys being G.I. Joe action figures, the board game Operation, Etch-a-Sketch. Those are just some of the toys here. Here's G.I. Joe's Operation, Etch-a-Sketch. This was in the 1960s. So the Cultural Revolution greatly shaped the younger generation's attitude, and some teenagers began to rebel against the social and moral norms in the 60s, of course. Only a small number participated in the hippie lifestyle, but more options of what to watch, play, or listen to became apparent. So more things for them to do in entertainment. So here's some, I remember when I was like in third grade, my cousin who I was going in to be a hairstylist, she styled my hair like that when I was in third grade, and I was kind of embarrassed because I had all this high hair. Can you believe that? Well, anyway, here's President Kennedy. Everyone's watching the president on TV. Here's a family in the 1960s, and here's their Volkswagen Bug. So this was family life in the 1960s. Family life in the 1970s. Families continued to be a central focus of society, but even more women joined the workforce. So women had a variety of new jobs open to them. Children continued to go to school and use newer inventions like pocket calculators to help them do their homework. More teenagers went to college now following high school, and new forms of entertainment were like they were listening to 8-track tapes, their favorite music, and Atari Pong video games. This is when I remember when Atari Pong came out. It's like everybody wanted that, and all it was this Pong going back and forth, and you're playing it. Way different than the video games today. Overall, the family remained the same, but divorce rate slightly increased at this time. So probably due to the 1960s and all the turmoil of the 1960s, you can imagine. So here's some pictures of life in the 70s, how they dressed. Here's some girls going to school. We're carrying our books, and on here, family here. Of course, the 8-track, and here's all the family in a van, their van here. This is dinner, normal 70s family eating dinner. Great pictures. Family in the 1980s. So American homes now were changing, and many times both parents went to work. And so women began having more opportunities to advance in the workplace. But most families continued to try to eat dinner together, but after dinner activities varied greatly. More television stations were available, and VCR recording device now was introduced so people could watch their own favorite shows on their own schedules now. And of course, they all had different favorite shows. So children spent time playing a video game or going to the video arcade or listening to their favorite music. And many teenagers had part-time jobs too. So in the 1980s, it became less uncommon to have only one parent. And the result of looser lifestyles of the 1960s, a lot of times they only had one parent, either as a divorce or a single parent. So here we have, here's some, and this is a famous TV show, All in the Family during this time. Here's a 1980s type, family eating dinner. See how their hairstyles were turned. Look at his hairstyle. Had these little mullets at the end, and anyway, hairstyle. And here we have the children, and they each have a Cabbage Patch doll. And you can see, can't remember this doll, but this was a very famous cartoon. Forgot his name though. But anyway, you can see the type of a type of toys that they had there too. Modern conveniences, new appliances were offered to make life easier. Refrigerators and vacuums were improved and more efficient. In the late 1940s was the first microwave oven. In 1950s, the dishwasher was common. That was really amazing invention. You could imagine, everyone wanted a dishwasher. Most families had an automatic washer and dryer and garbage disposal, and electric sewing machine, automatic coffee pots, blenders, mixers, and toasters were added during this time too. A lot of modern conveniences. Technology was increasing in all areas. Fads. There's a lot of fads. We go through fads, especially in a country where the kids don't have a lot to do and they get bored, then they think they have to go through some new thing. Well, anyway, Americans had much more free time than they had in the last decades. Children and adults were enthralled with temporary crazes, and they called these crazes fads, which usually take a country by storm and then they soon disappear. So they're really popular and then they're gone. In 1950s, the hula hoop, although some kids still do hula hoops, but the hula hoop was a big fad and it sold 100 million hula hoops during that time. But it was short-lived. They got that, we're done with the hula hoop. Then in the 1960s, President Kennedy inspired Americans to place great emphasis on physical fitness. So the 50-mile hike became a fad for a short. Can you imagine? I usually go on a walk each day for like 5 miles at the most, but 10 times that. A 50-mile hike is quite a bit. Also, during this time, the presidential fitness program was started through President Kennedy in the schools. And so all the kids had to get the Presidential Fitness Award. And to get that, they had to do certain exercises to certain levels so that they could win the Presidential Fitness Award. And that was all the way through school when I went to school. So another fad was stuffing as many people as possible into a telephone booth. I remember that, huh? That was crazy. Or stuffing as many people into a car. Look at this Volkswagen Bug and all. How many people can you stuff in a car? Crazy fad. A peculiar fad was owning a pet rock with a manual on how to take care of your pet rock. There were 1 million pet rocks sold in a few months. Pet rocks. And then, of course, was the Cabbage Patch Dolls. They were running out of Cabbage Patch Doll, and they went for a lot of money, especially when they started running out. So pet rocks and Cabbage Patch Dolls, kind of crazy. But hula hoops, all these things, fads come and fads go. Culture and literature. During the Cold War, many sports events were viewed as battlefields as athletes competed against the Soviet Union. So, because it was a Cold War, many Americans spent more time reading and visiting museums, listening to music, and watching sports. So, can you imagine? Would you like to be visiting museums? We loved museums. I actually had a friend whose parents ran the museum, and so we got to see all kinds of things, and it was fun at that time to go and tour the museum. Here's a picture of a museum, and so even to see some of the stuff they had, in these little cases in the museum. And of course, watching sports has always been, and music. During the Cold War, modern trends in literature rejected the American culture and biblical morality in a lot of ways. However, some authors experimented with some styles and traditional themes. One of the famous children's author, and he's a Christian author, was Theodore Geisel, and he was known as Dr. Seuss. And he was characterized by rhymes and images, and he became famous, and Dr. Seuss books became famous, in America at this time. Everyone wanted to have Dr. Seuss books and were reading them. Another was Harper Lee, and he wrote the book To Kill a Mockingbird. Here's a picture there. And it was published in 1960, and it reflected the sentiments of the civil rights movement and a story about a lawyer who defended a wrongly accused Black American in the Depression of Alabama. So it was looking into what was going on with civil rights, throughout this time. And so everyone wanted to read To Kill a Mockingbird. So here's a motorcycle here during that time. Culture and literature. On to art. Art continued in the artistic movement of abstract. Here's an abstract expression. Can you imagine that? The abstract art rejected the rules and standards of arts. Instead, it focused on the emotions. What kind of emotions does this art give you? Jackson Pollock, who lived in 1912 to 1956, was known for drip paintings. He lay a canvas on the floor, and then he would, with his canvas, he would randomly drip paint on it to his emotions. And this would be his abstract art. And it would go for quite a bit of money. Kind of weird, huh? But it did. Some painters still used traditional methods, though, and had a realistic represented in art. And there was, of course, the famous painter. You need to go in and look at a lot of his paintings. I love his paintings, and they're all about America, is Norman Rockwell. It says Normal, but his name's Norman. Norman Rockwell, 1894 to 1978. And he was known for painting covers for magazines, like the Saturday Post here. But he began to produce most of his famous works after World War II, and he portrayed an ordinary American in a familiar setting, often focusing on boyhood and children in small towns. And these remain some of the best loved representations of American life during this time. Here's some pictures that you can see. This picture here. Here's two boys here. Here's baseball. Here's the Saturday Post. All of these are Norman Rockwell. Theater and music. Grand music productions in the theaters drew lots of people, huge audiences. The Broadway musicals brought classic American songs, and later some became popular films such as Rodgers and Hammerstein's The Sound of Music. So The Sound of Music became a Broadway musical. Here's a picture. This actually is the film, that we were used to seeing The Sound of Music there. But this here was actually the Broadway musical, as they traveled with the Broadway musical. A lot of times, New York City is very famous for Broadway musicals there in their theaters. So popular music turned towards the king of rock and roll. Who's the king of rock and roll? I hope you know that. Elvis Presley here. So Elvis Presley started the rock and roll music. In 1960s, a four-man British group called the Beatles toured the United States several times, and their music enthralled America as it resonated with the social trends of the Cultural Revolution. So here we go. Here's the Beatles. Here's a picture of the Beatles when they first appeared on TV on the Ed Sullivan Show. So radio and television. Radio lost most of its drama and comedy to television. So radio then turned its focus mainly to music, with short little episodes of the daily news. So on the radio, you'd hear the news, and then you'd hear mainly music. The former radio programs were adapted now for television. So you didn't have to just listen to them, you could see them. Some programs continued for over 2 decades now on television. Most Americans turned in to watch the evening news with Walter Cronkite. Here's a picture of Walter Cronkite up here in the corner. This is between 1916 to 2009. And he was entitled The Most Trusted Man in America. Now, I don't know really if he's the most trusted man, but Americans have thought he was. But he gave our news, Walter Cronkite News. And then the popular programs in the 1960s, of course, were Leave It to Beaver. Here's a picture of Leave It to Beaver here. Leave It to Beaver down here at the bottom here. And Father Knows Best here at the top. Those two reflected the social standards of the day. And then the 1970s and 1980s focused more on the role of women and more comedy during that time to ease the tensions of the Vietnam War time. And then westerns like Gunsmoke and Bonanza here were very popular too. Motion pictures. Television now offered what only movie theaters had provided, right? So now we had television. So the film studios began to make fewer pictures, but gave their production companies greater budgets. They had more money now to produce higher quality films that could outshine anything on a television show. And a television show would have a lower budget. So now the films, having more money, were producing films where people would want to go watch them in the theater. One of the most popular films at this time was Star Wars. And in the 1950s, the film industry abolished its guidelines and outlawed in the Hays Code, replacing it with a rating system that used looser standards. And filmmakers gradually could produce nearly anything, regardless of how violent or how immoral it was, as long as they accepted the restricted ratings. You can see there was a great need for spiritual revival. So here's Star Wars. Yes, Star Wars, one of those movies. It was like they never thought that Star Wars, when they produced it, would be anything as spectacular as it was, but it was like a big hit. Everyone wanted to go see Star Wars. And then, of course, when they talked here about the Hays Code, the rating code went away. Basically, they set the rating code that we have today, so on the age limit. So they didn't prevent them but they basically gave the rating code to families, so they knew if something was rated, P or PG-13. You had, they not recommended for anybody, under 13. Or parental guidance, and onto the restricting of different movies. So, but there was a great need. Even now, what's on the movies would never be on the movies, back, 20 years ago or, 30 years ago, So, and we can see there's a great need for spiritual revival and what we look at all the time. Sports. Two great developments in sports during the Cold War times were breaking the code of color, the color barrier, and also the arrival of television. So before 1947, most professional sports leagues had rejected Black American players, but the skill, talent, and upstanding character of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, lived 1919 to 1972, helped to dispel this when he became the first Black American to play with a major league team. Here's Jackie Robinson. Everybody loved Jackie Robinson, and they loved him and thought, wow, and he's one of he's breaking the code, because before there was rarely any Black athletes at all. And so Jackie Robinson breaks this and helps dispel the not having them, and as that bringing on more Black athletes in sports and baseball, basketball. And at the college level, the Texas Western Miners basketball team became the first to have an all-Black starting up lineup, which was frowned upon until they actually defeated the Kentucky Wildcats in the national championship and became national champions. The Texas Western Miners were a Black team, all of Black Americans. Their success opened the door for Black American athletes to play at college levels, which had been very uncommon before this time. Baseball stars. Willie Mays, 1931 until now, and he is a Black American who's sometimes considered to have been better than Babe Ruth, Willie Mays. Hank Aaron, Black American, broke Babe Ruth's career home run record and won with 755 home runs. So Willie Mays and Hank Aaron here. Boxing. With boxing, we have Walker Sugar Ray Robinson. They called him Sugar Ray. Lived 1920 to 1989, a Black American boxer who fought in the 1950s, and he was considered the greatest pound for pound boxer of all time. Here we have a picture. And then, of course, the other boxer that's famous is the American boxer Muhammad Ali, living in 1942 to 2016, and he was considered the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time. Television and sports. So television allowed fans to see their favorite athletes without having to be there, right? Football was one of the first sports to take advantage of TV. In this way, they could challenge baseball and spectacular too, but spectator sports. Football benefited from the arrival of the Cleveland Browns, and Jim Brown was the greatest running back of all time, one of the greatest running backs of all time. Here's a picture of Jim Brown up here. The National Hockey League was popularized by Wayne Gretzky. Right here is Wayne Gretzky, whose speed and scoring electrified crowds. Professional basketball gained popularity through stars like Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan. Here's a picture of them all, so here's Wilt, as we go from Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, on to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar over here. Here, of course, is Michael Jordan, and here is, of course, Larry Bird here. So you can see their pictures. The golf's greatest star was Jack Nicklaus, I should say, with the fellow golf stars of Arnold Palmer and Gary Player. So here they are, Jack Nicklaus, and on to Arnold Palmer and Gary Player. So we covered lots of sports, and we have a lot of sports fans, finding their so-called sport favorite champion to watch. Olympics. The Olympic athletes were required to be amateurs. So that meant that most Olympians, including those from the United States, were college students or full-time workers that had a sports hobby, mainly college students. Well, the communist athletes were often professionals who were given nominal positions in the military or government to consider them as amateurs. So most of the communist nations, they didn't go by these rules. So several communist athletes cheated by using performance-enhancing drugs called PEDs, but they were not discovered until years later. The Soviets generally won more Olympic medals, although Americans outperformed the Soviets many times. Rivalry was at the highest in 1972 when the Soviet basketball team upset the Americans in Munich. So Olympics miracle on ice. The Americans upset some of the greatest hockey players in history when the all-amateur American ice hockey team defeated the Soviet team in the 1980s in the Olympics in Lake Placid, New York. The game became known as the Miracle on Ice after sportscaster Al Michaels' famous call as the clock ran down said, "Do you believe in miracles?" And guess what? An Olympic miracle did happen with our hockey team. Miracle on ice. The U.S. shocks the Russians as we beat their greatest hockey players. So a miracle on ice. So Olympics, very important, part of, I say important, as Americans looked on. It was an uplifter during this time. Even though we were behind in many areas on the Olympics to the Russians, Americans watched and cheered for those greatest Olympic stars during this time. And even today, we're watching the Olympics, I think, this week. So that's daily life during the Cold War period, part of the time I lived during this period. So I can look back and I can see and remember some of these things.